Hello and welcome to Thyros Web Development Tips and Tutorials. This video is a complete guide to all the available Flexbox utility classes in Tailwind CSS. I'll explain each of them practically with simple examples. If you already know the basics of CSS Flexbox, that's great. You can skip the first few minutes, but if you don't know much, I will help you understand the concepts better. Flexbox is a method that allows us to lay out items in one dimension, horizontally or vertically. Before Flexbox, we had to use floats or tables for layouts and some ugly hacks to achieve the intended layouts. But with the use of Flex, it's much simpler to achieve the same, provided you understand all the properties of Flexbox. So to start with, a Flexbox needs a container, usually invisible, within which we have the items laid out the way we want. Container is the parent and these items are the children. Again, these items can themselves be flex containers for smaller items within them and so on. To start using Flexbox, the first thing to be done is to set the parent element to display flex. In regular CSS, it's display flex, while in Tailwind CSS, the utility class name is just flex. Okay, let's jump into practicals now. Let's go to play.tailwindcss.com and let me remove all of this here and let's start from the beginning. So let's have a parent container div with class flex. And now within which let's have some small divs. Let's call them blocks. Block 1, block 2, block 3 and block 4. Now you notice the moment we have added flex, they are laid out horizontally. So if you remove that, this is obviously the default behavior, right? Each div is a block element which occupies full width. So the moment we add class flex, by default, they are laid out in the horizontal direction. So using Tailwind classes, let me add some padding to each of them and maybe some color. Let's say PG yellow 200, and let me repeat this with slightly different colors. So maybe blue, green and red. Okay, so now that we have a container, parent container and the items, let's explore the next set of properties that are available. We are right now exploring the properties of the parent container. Further, we will move into the properties of the child container. So the first one being display flex. By default, we saw that the items are laid out horizontally. But what if we want to change that? Which is why we have all of these, which we have the flex direction property in regular CSS and the values for which is row, row reverse, column and column reverse. We'll see all of that in action in a few seconds. The same equivalent in Tailwind is just flex row reverse, flex call and flex call reverse. So here by default it's flex row, so nothing changes. But if you make it flex row reverse, you will notice that it's the reverse. So we had it going from left to right, now we have it going from right to left. This is useful in some cases. Next, if we change that to flex call, you will notice that they're laid out vertically now, and then flex call reverse does the exact opposite. So we're going from bottom to top instead of top to bottom. Let me leave it at flex row for now. Next comes the properties flex wrap. That is, whether you want the flex items to move into the next line if they overflow or just to stay there. And also, wrap reverse defines how exactly it wraps. The Tailwind equivalent for this is just wrap, wrap reverse and no wrap. So it's just these values. Now let's see what it does. But to see that, we need to have slightly bigger blocks. Let me add some content here. Now that we have some extra content here, you see that the lines automatically broke into two lines because by default, flex wrap property is no wrap. So if you add no flex no wrap here, that's what actually it is. But instead, if you want to change it to flex wrap, that is, we are okay if it goes into the next line, just don't, compress the width. That's what we're trying to say it. And if you make it flex wrap reverse, you see, instead of going from top to bottom, now it goes from bottom to top. So it wraps in the reverse direction. This is about flex wrap properties. Again, let me just remove it and leave it at flex wrap. One thing you must notice here is that the width of the item is dependent on the content within, right? If you have come across CSS grid, it's different. In grid, you mention the exact width, right? So either all the columns are of same width, or it's in multiples of the width of one of the columns, one or two of the columns. But in Flex, that's the main difference between CSS Flex and CSS Grid. If you want them of some sort of an equal width or in a proportion, then you better use CSS Grid. But if you want the width to depend on the content within, you use CSS Flex. So you don't have to worry if this is if this has a lot of content, like say, let me add some lorem ipsum text. You see, since this has a lot of content, it takes a lot more space than the other three here. Okay, this was just for demonstration. I'll remove it and we leave it at this. Let's continue. So we have covered the flex direction, flex wrap. Now is the time to see how to align the content vertically and horizontally within this container. For that, what we have is justify content. Now, this is where a lot of confusion occurs. So let's take it slow. We use the justify content property to space out the items horizontally for a flex row. But if you're using a flex column, justify content is what defines how the items space out in the vertical direction. So if you are using flex row, your main axis is the x-axis, that is horizontal, and justify content defines the spacing of items in the main axis. Whether you're using flex row or flex column, it defines the spacing in the main axis. That's what you need to remember. So the Tailwind equivalent classes for this is justify start, justify end, justify center, and so on. So the content word is skipped and the flex word and space words are skipped. It's just justify, start, end, and so on. Now let's see each of this in action. For this, I might have to go back to what it was, smaller divs. That's when justify content has some meaning. So again, justify content is a parent property. That's why we are adding it here. If you see justify, now forget about justify items. This is not a flex property. Let's start with justify start. Now you'll not be able to see much of a difference because justify start is the default value. But when you come to justify end, you see everything moves towards the end. So justify start says the start of the main axis and justify end is the end of the main axis. Now what I mean to say is if you make it justify end and instead of having flex row, if you make it flex row reverse, you notice that now justify end is this side, right? So if you use flex row reverse, it might be slightly confusing. Let's go back. Now justify end, then justify center. So it puts it in the center of the main axis. Justify between spaces out the items as much as possible. So that's the maximum spacing that's possible. Justify around does give a little spacing on the right and the left, which is half the spacing in between the items, which means whatever spacing is here, these three are equivalent spacing, and these two spacing at the end is exactly half of this space. But justify evenly makes sure that even these spaces are same. So how many ever spaces are there around each of the items are all equal. You would usually use something like justify center or justify between. Of course, you might even use start and end. All right. So let me just leave it at justify between for now. And let's check out the next properties. Now this was about spacing the elements in the main axis. So in our case, because it was flex row, we saw the spacing of elements in the horizontal direction. Now next comes align items. These are the properties we use to align the items vertically. But in flex column, we will use these to align them horizontally. So it might be a little confusing if you're new to this concept, but slowly you'll get a hang of it. And the Tailwind equivalent is here, notice the word align is missing, and instead we use items start. That's where many people think that these properties are missing, but they're not. So you use item start, items end, item center, and so on. Now let's see them in action. For this, we might need a slight variation of the height. So what I'll do is I'll increase the font size of this, make it text 5XL. So you see the height is increased. But did you also notice that the height of all the other blocks also increased? That's because by default, the value of align items is set to items stretch. So that's the default, which means it says stretch all the heights, because it's in the vertical direction, right? Stretch all the heights to match the highest one, right? But instead, if you make it items start, you notice that all the items start from the same line, and of course items end will make all the blocks align at the bottom. As you might have guessed, items center makes it align exactly at the center. So this is equivalent to vertical align middle. But if you notice, sorry, let me make it center. Yeah, if you notice, this looks quite off. Like if you remove the background colors here, at least the first two, you'll notice that these are not aligned. The bottom of the text is not aligned, which might look a little odd, which is why we have something called items baseline. That is, when you set it to items baseline, the base of the font, whatever text is there, it gets aligned in one line. You might be able to see it better. So you see, there's an invisible line going exactly below the text. When you want text to be aligned like this, you use items baseline. Otherwise, you can use items center or whatever works for you. So let's keep it at item center, and I will add the colors back. BG blue 200 and BG yellow 200. Now, before we move on to the next set of properties, I think it's better to show you how these items appear in the vertical direction. So if we set it to flex call, and let's give a height to this whole container, maybe h80. Yes, so you see it's h80, that's the height of the container. If you want better view, we can even add a background, maybe a very light gray, so that this is the container. And because we have justify between, right, justify between is what determines the spacing in the same direction as the flex. Okay, so because it's column, justify between makes it align, gives it as much space as possible. The same thing if you make justify center, you can vertically align it in the center of the block. Okay, so justify center, item center is exactly what you need to put something in the center of the page or center of a container, right, horizontally and vertically. Again, if you make it justify end or justify start, this is what you see, evenly and around as well. Okay, let me put it back to justify between. And now item center, this is what makes the items appear in the center of in the horizontal direction, because we're using flex call. But if we say items stretch, it stretches. Item start, this is what it does. items end, items, what else do we have? Baseline doesn't work in column because it doesn't make sense. It's the same as items start. And yeah, so that's what we have available. Let me change it back to item center, and also let me remove this, or I can keep it and let me have another one with a little bit of margin, and here let me change it to just flex, so you really know the difference. And I will copy this link, so this link will be available in the description below. You can play with it and make the changes the way you want. Let's say I'll leave it to item stretch, so you can explore this and make more changes to understand yourself. Now let's move on to the next set of properties. So far we saw justify content and align items. Next we have align content. Now this is very similar to align items, only thing is align items works when the flex wrap is set to no wrap, and align content works with the same set of values when the flex wrap is set to wrap, that is when the items wrap to the next set of lines. This is what works, and the tailwind equivalent is content center, content start, and so on. Again, the align word is missing here. That's why the align word is missing in both of these, because we use items and content. Everything else remains the same: center, start, end, and so on. Let's see this practically. For this, we will have to add some more text, and we need to say flex wrap. Okay, let's add some more text. Okay, now we have them wrapping, and you see there's some space immediately between the two blocks, because I think the default value is set to content around. Let's check it out. So now if you make this content center, you see that they are in the center. The reason for this small space here is because the height of this is greater. Everything is in the center as much as possible. Content start pushes it to the start of the main axis, sorry, the cross axis. Content end pushes it to the end. Content between makes sure there's as much space as possible, and then content around is what is the default. It gives double the space here and half the space around it, and content evenly spaces it out evenly. So this is the spacing between the elements when the flex wrap is this is for the flex wrap property. So if we set this to content center and we set this to items end, you will notice that that gap is gone. Or you can even say items stretch, so that these items stretch to make sure that they occupy the same height as this, but it doesn't affect this block, right? So of course this might be confusing again, but the more you use it, the more you'll get used to it. And if you set this to justify center, this is what you have. Again, I will leave this as it is. You can play around. With this, we have covered all the properties of the parent element, right? What all did we cover? We covered flex, display flex. We covered the flex direction, either it's flex call or by default it's flex row. Then we have the flex wrap or the flex no wrap or flex reverse. So it wraps in the reverse direction. Then we have the justify content properties, which determines the spacing in the main axis. Then we have the align items property, which determines the spacing in the other axis, the cross axis. And then we have align content, which determines the spacing between the items that are wrapped. Okay, with this much clear, let's move on to the next set of properties of the child elements. The first set of properties of a child element I would like to talk about is align self. So with align items and align content that we set to the parent element, we have given a alignment to all the elements. But what if you want to align only one or two elements a little differently? That's where we can set these properties to the child element that we want to align differently. The Tailwind equivalent of this is self auto, self start. It starts with self. Let's see what it all means. So coming to the first example, we have set items stretch, right? But what if we want the block 4 not to stretch fully, but just stay, to the start maybe? For that, only to this element, we can set self start. You notice everything else is stretch, nothing else changes, but this is set to start. If we want to center it, we can say self center, and now that doesn't stretch. It centers itself, and again self end and self stretch is available, which is obviously the same thing as the parent. Okay, let me make this self center and leave it at that. Now you understand this. The same case with flex column. So in this case, if you don't want the third one to stretch, instead remain in the center for some reason, you can say self center, and again it works in the same direction as this items stretch. So that's about the align self property. Moving on. So far we spoke about alignment in both the directions, horizontal, vertical. We spoke about flex direction, we spoke about flex wrap. Now let's talk about the size of each flex item. As we saw, it automatically occupied the space based on the content within. But what if we want to control that a little? What if we want to make sure that some items occupy a little more space than the others? That's where we have these properties flex grow, and in regular CSS we have flex grow 0, 1 and 2, 3 and any such numbers, but usually the values used are 0 and 1. If you want to use 2, 3, you can customize it in the Tailwind configuration. But for this, the Tailwind equivalent is flex grow 0 and just flex grow, because flex grow 0 means that you don't want the element to grow or increase in size, but flex grow 1 means you're saying yes, it can take up more space. Let's see it practically now. Let me open up a new play window. This has too much already. I'll share this link as well. Let me take the same thing and remove flex call. Let me also remove this, and I don't need the height for now. Right. So now you saw each of this occupies only so much as the content. But let's say we want this one to occupy as much space available. By default, it occupies only as much space as required by the content. That means flex grow by default is 0. It's saying don't grow. But instead, let's change it to flex grow 1, that is just flex grow, and immediately you notice that all those spaces are gone and they're occupied by this one block. If you want block 3 also to occupy a lot more space, you can again set flex grow to 1. So it divides the width proportionately. That, if you notice, the width of the blue block is greater than green block, it proportionately increases the width based on the content. Now there's a particular calculation, you don't have to know much about it, you're just saying flex grow, so you're allowing both of them to grow. So now you don't see any space. Let me remove this so you're able to see this better in action. Okay, let me copy this and paste it again for the next example, right? And the next example is the opposite of grow, that is shrink. So you're telling whether the item should shrink or set the width to the content. And the Tailwind equivalent is again similar, flex shrink 0 and flex shrink. The default value of flex shrink is 1. So in case of flex grow, the default value was 0, but in case of shrink, the default value is 1. So by default, all the elements of flex don't grow. They occupy only so much as the content is required. but they shrink if required. So when we applied flex wrap, the items shrink in width, right? So that's the default behavior. Let's see another example of that. Now, if we have a lot of content here, something like this, and you notice that it moves into the next line, right? What if we don't want that whatsoever? We want it to be in the same line. We can say don't shrink, right? Because by default it's shrinking. We can say flex shrink 0. So you notice it doesn't shrink. It takes up all the space that is required by the content, and the rest of the blocks shrink as much as possible, even if it makes the parent container overflow, right? So it's saying don't shrink no matter what. Now you might be wondering, where are these flex grow and flex shrink useful in real world? Let me show you some example. So let's say we have some, okay, this is the parent container, and let's say we have two child containers. One is some text, lorem ipsum text, and on the left side, let's say we have some icon, okay, and let's say we have some circular shape. Let me give it a width 16, height 16, a background of maybe cyan 200, and then I want this to be circle, right? So I say round it full. Do you already notice that the circle is shrinking? It's not a circle anymore. We don't want this behavior, right? If let's say the paragraph is small, then great. So if the paragraph is only so much, then there's enough space for it to look like a circle. But as we saw, if the paragraph is really large, then this shrinks. We don't want that to happen, which is where the flex shrink 0 is useful. So you say flex shrink 0, don't shrink this, and give it as much space as required. This is just one of the use case. There will be a lot more, and I think the flex grow use case is more evident because this is generally what your navigation bar looks like. The center space is full. Here comes a logo, and generally here comes the navigation items, and in this space sometimes you can have whatever content required, or maybe an image or something else like that. That's where the flex grow property becomes useful. Let's move on. Next comes the property which is just flex. This is actually the shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and something called as flex basis, which we haven't yet covered. Now, what is flex basis? Now, flex basis tells exactly the amount of space that it has to occupy. So it's not telling whether it's you have to grow or shrink. It's saying it's actually giving the width in percentage, either 0% or 50%, 30%, or even something like 300 pixels, 10 rem, and things like that. So that is a different property, flex basis, for which there are no Tailwind utilities because it's very rarely used. I'll also show you how to customize it next. But this flex is the shorthand property, and generally the values used are these, that is 110%, which is grow 1, shrink 1, and 0%. I'll show you where this is used. Then 1 auto, 0 1 auto, and none. The equivalent for them is flex 1, flex auto, flex initial, and flex none. I will not be covering the three of these below, but I'll show you what flex 1 can do. Let me add some space here. Again, let me copy this and put it here. Let me just give flex 1 to each of this. Sorry. Let me space them out a little more. So let me add flex 1, flex, instead of flex grow, flex 1, flex 1, and flex 1. So do you notice now we have all four divs occupying the same space because we are saying it it grows and shrinks by equal value, and then the flex basis is 0%. That means it's the same size. Basis is the equivalent of width for flex items. So it's saying 0%, which is same as 25%. But what if you want an exact value? So let me remove this third block, and let's say you want this as the sidebar left, you want this as the sidebar right, and you want this as the main content. And let's say you want this as 25%, you want this twice the width, and you want this, that is 50%, and you want this 25%. Yes, we can customize it using Tailwind. So if you need something like flex basis 33%, that is, say 3 columns, or 33% and 67%, or if you want something like 25%, which I just spoke about, this is what you do. You go to the Tailwind config, tailwind.config.js, which I will do next, and you set this. I'll show you exactly how it's done. And then you can use these classes flex 1/3, because 33% is 1/3, 67% is 2/3, and 25% is 1/4. Of course, this can be anything. Instead of 1/3, you can say 33 exactly, and then you say flex 33. But that's a little more confusing, which is why I thought 1/3 suits a little more, right? Let's do this. So if you go to the config file, within the extend block, after whatever else is present here, you can say flex, and whatever is the class name that you need after flex. Don't worry about this error, it'll get fixed in a moment. And then the value for this is 1, 1, that is flex grow and flex shrink, and then 33%. But what we want is 25%, right? So let me change it. 25%, and then we want 50%. So we do 1/2, and then 1, 1, 50%. Again, like I said, you can as well say 25, you can say 1/4 if you need. So this is entirely up to you. I'll make it 1/4. This is still loading, but let's continue. And here I can use flex 1/4, flex 1/2. I need to remove this, and flex 1/4. So you see, we have this occupying 25%, 50%, and 25%. Now you find this useful, right? Actually, if you need such a behavior, you'd rather use CSS grids, but sometimes you might want to use a Flexbox for some reason. So if you really need this, then you can configure like I just showed, and you can use it. Great. Next, we have just one last thing pending, and that is the property of the child element, which is order. Currently, all the items are placed in the same order as it's mentioned, or the reverse order if you use the flex column reverse or flex row reverse. What if you want to change it a little more, right? For which we have order 1. This is the regular CSS, so you can actually give any number to order. But in Tailwind CSS, you have the utility classes from order 1 up to 12. So even if you have 12 items and you want to shuffle them up, you can do that up to 12. Beyond that, you'll have to customize it. Or if you just want to set an item to first, you give a value, a negative value of 9999, something similar to Z index, what you do, right? And order last, if you use order last class, then yeah, it sets it to 9999, so it's at the end. And then order none, if you want to remove the ordering, you use this, so it sets it to 0. We'll see where this could be useful. Now, taking the example of the sidebar and main content, this works for larger screens, right? But for smaller screens, you'll want them one below the other. So you'll want the flex direction to change from row to column. But since Tailwind is mobile first, it'll first be flex column, and then for larger devices, MD, we can say flex row. So if you, yeah, this is how it works. So here, let's say this is great. But when you go to smaller devices, you don't want the sidebar to appear first. You want the main content to appear first. We can't change the order in the HTML, right? That's where the order property becomes useful. So for mobile layout, we need this to be ordered first, right? We want order 1 here, or you can use order first here, so it makes sure that the other two come next. And for larger screens, you can remove the ordering by saying order none. Okay, we'll see if this works. Yes, so it removes the order. That means it follows the default order. And then here, this comes first. This is just one of the use case. Of course, it can be used elsewhere also. That's about all the properties of Flex for which you have the Tailwind equivalence. Just one last thing I would like to cover here, which is the spacing between these elements. So by default, there is no property in Flexbox in CSS which helps you create some space. So that is one big disadvantage compared to Grid. In Grid, you have a gap that you can give, but in Flex, that's not a property available. But in Tailwind CSS, you can make use of the space X and the space Y utilities. Let's take the first one and just say space X. That means space it out in the horizontal direction, space X1, space X2, space X3. You see, the spacing is increasing as much as you want. So let me set it to space X4. But in case of flex call, let me copy this again. I'll remove it. If we don't have the height, okay, and all of them are stretched, we can make use of the space Y utilities by giving space Y 1, 2, 3. You see, the elements get spaced vertically. Alright, so this is not available in regular CSS, but it's available in Tailwind. You can make use of it and give some spacing to the flex items. This is about it. I have covered everything that's needed, but anytime you need to refer, you know that the documentation is amazing, right? So the official documentation, you can search for anything. Let's say you want to know about flex direction. You can go to flex direction, you can refer this, and you can see how to customize it. And if you need something like I said, just space between, right? The space Y and the space X utilities. There's something called space Y reverse also. So just in case you set it to the row reverse or column reverse, you additionally give this class so that it adds the spacing in the right direction. You can, of course, dive deeper into all of these concepts. This is about Flex, a complete guide. So I hope this covered a lot of stuff for you, and I hope it cleared a lot of doubts as well. If you still have some doubts, you can mention in the comments below and I'll reply. Thank you for watching. Have great fun with Tailwind and Flex. Thank you for watching. Hit a like and share this video ahead. If you enjoyed watching this, don't forget to subscribe below and turn on the notifications so you won't miss a single video from Tyrus.